earth minerals in the world, approximately 5% of global reserves, and is also the fourth largest producer of rare earths, around 8% of global production. Australia does not have significant facilities for processing raw rare earth mineral ores and exports the raw ores to China. The motion is that we support the Australian government aggressively growing its domestic refinement and production of rare earth minerals. We'll invite the first affirmative speaker to open up the case for their side. Hear, hear.
Australia is a country that has high potential for rare earth minerals, and that's incredibly important. More actors on the stage and more players doing this decreases the power of China, and it's better because Australia has better practices. 3 parts of the speech. The first is setup. 3 pieces of setup. The first thing that I want to discuss is what is the status quo. The first thing to understand is that China has total dominance over the entire supply chain of rare earth minerals. Firstly, in the extraction of rare earth minerals. The reason why Australia is 4th in the world with 5% only is because China is 1st in the world with over 80% of the rare earth minerals. But not only that, they also have significant control over the other areas of the supply chain. Because countries like Australia, regions like Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia that also have rare earth minerals, do this thing where they export their raw earths to China, which just means they do all of the refining, etc. What does this aggressive pursuit look like? Firstly, we think that this looks like the Australian government supporting the downstreaming of rare earth minerals in Australia, which is when you increase your capacity over the supply chain. So currently we just extract them. What this likely looks like is current firms or additional firms increasing which bits of the supply chain of rare earth minerals that they do. This likely looks like things like subsidies, things like public-private agreements, and things like legislation that supports existing types of things, etc. Recently, Australia has signed more environmental protections, etc. That is likely to be in this. Third piece of setup, what is the status of rare earth minerals in general? The first thing to understand is that these products are hyper inelastic. That is, everyone needs them. This is a fledgling industry that is only growing into the future. This is because rare earth minerals are needed for things like batteries, they're needed for lithium batteries, they're needed for electric cars, electric vehicles, which are only going to get more important, they're needed for renewable energy, which is only going to be an increasing factor in our world, etc. All of these high-tech things in our world, all renewable energy, all need rare earth minerals, which means the demand will always be there, it is only growing. What changes in the debate is about whether Australia's entrance into this helps or hinders. First argument, how this stabilizes the global market, increases competition, and makes rare earth minerals cheaper. The first thing to understand is why would Australia do this well? Firstly, on time. First thing I want to say is that a lot of these businesses are close locally to the rare earth minerals, that is refinery and production, etc. is aligned. Secondly, obviously these companies can achieve economies of scale. That is, if you're a few large companies in Australia, you can just align this to other parts of it. But thirdly, Australia already has refineries for other things that we extract out of the ground. For example, despite producing a lot of natural gas, Australia is still a net natural gas importer, because what we do is we refine the natural gas, etc. This is clearly something that we have the capacity to do. What this means is that Australia can do this quickly and well overall. But also, because the private market is likely to be interested in Australia. It's good for business, there's relatively low corporate taxes, and there's likely to be tax subsidies for this. Secondly, on how Australia is able to do this well on price. Firstly, manufacturing will be done here, and things like subsidies means that despite a high minimum wage, it's likely to be done cheaply. This is likely to be highly supported by the Australian government in their aggressive pursuit. But secondly, at the point at which Australia enters the market, they have to compete because China still remains a large producer, which means that Australian rare earth mineral companies must stay competitive. So the point at which they do this, they have to stay close in price to China or even a little lower. Maybe they don't get lower, but they have to be around that area in order to compete. Why is it a good thing that Australia enters the market if they can do it well? Firstly, China's production and supply of rare earth minerals is increasingly volatile. China knows, because of their insane dominance over the supply chain, that they can weaponize their hegemony as trade leverage for people. For example, they threaten the EU to sign trade deals in order to retain the agreements about rare earth minerals because they know how much the EU needs rare earth minerals. Empirically, they have restricted the sale of rare earth minerals to countries like Japan and South Korea. And that's obviously incredibly bad because those are high-tech advanced economies that produce high-tech manufacturers, and they need the rare earth minerals for things like batteries, for things like EVs. How do we change this? Firstly, we increase export actors to these actors. Because Australia is able to produce more, that just means that people have more options of where they buy rare earth minerals from. But secondly, Australia is a much less volatile trade partner on the global stage than China is. In this example itself, Australia is an ally of Japan and South Korea and places like that, and probably wouldn't do the volatile things that China would do of taking away their access to earth minerals, etc. But thirdly, Australia has strong FTAs and is a strong partner on the global trade stage, and they're important. What this does is it stabilizes the market in a few ways. It reduces investor insecurity because in the status quo, the red tape and steps of shipping minerals to China and then shipping them back and so on is just a little scary. There's more things that could go wrong. It decreases the red tape. But thirdly, what it does is it frees countries from being restricted to only one country. Firstly, because Australia is likely to do it better in a multiple ways as above. But secondly, even if they don't, it's at least a different option. That is, now countries have more choice. And obviously that has implications for things like price, etc. when you have more than one actor in the market. Now places like Southeast Asia and the EU don't have to get bullied by China into signing adverse trade agreements when they otherwise wouldn't, because there are just more people in the market. Note that stability and investor confidence and things like that on the global market reduce prices. It maximizes people's options and it prevents price gouging. Because now China can't price gouge their rare earth minerals if they know there's another actor on the stage. And thirdly, they're likely to be less disrupted by supply chains, e.g. time lag of shipping and stuff like that. It's just less, because now the whole process is happening in Australia. This is incredibly important because the competition just does reduce prices, and this is important impacting because rare earth minerals are good and important and we need them. These are things that help our future. These are the things that get us electric cars, that get us renewable energy, that get us chips to go in our phones and in batteries. And these things aren't optional, right? We need them. We need this technology, and that is important. It's important for the countries that need to produce these items to do this. It's important for economies around the world, but secondly, it's important for consumers. Because when things like renewables are cheaper, when things like electric cars are cheaper, that is when we are all benefited. That is when we live in a better world. Second argument, this is better for the environment. The framing of this argument is that because rare earth minerals are so inelastic, they are going to be produced either way. Our point is that the production in Australia is likely to be more environmentally conscious, which is good if we have to do it at all. The first part of this argument is that production in China is environmentally bad because the CCP does not care about the environment that much. Why? A few reasons. Firstly, because the CCP is an autocracy, there's no electoral pressure even if Chinese people care about the environment. Secondly, the CCP's economic priority is to win the trade war and get global hegemony and increase GDP. They have the world's largest GDP because they feel like they have this humiliation they deserve to be the largest country in the world. They may have made some steps towards change, but it's not enough. And we would say that anything like renewables, it's just done in the pursuit of more GDP and being more of a player. It's not because they actually care. Why is Australia better at the environment? Few reasons. Firstly, there's greater electoral pressure in Australia, and there is a shifting change overall to Australians and Australian governments caring about the environment. The current party is a left-wing party, but there are electoral incentives for more people across the political spectrum caring about it. Things like the Teals demonstrate that right-wing people also care about the environment. Things like the rise of the Greens show that left-wing people care about the environment. It's increasingly bipartisan because more people are waking up to things like the coal industry, etc. But secondly, Australia needs an economic alternative to coal. It's not viable for our economy to keep going in this way forever. The upshot of this is that wherever the degradation happens, that is bad. We should care about the environment. Australia makes it less worse. Proud to affirm. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that fine speech, and now invite the first negative speaker to begin the negative case. Hear, hear.
Three arguments in the speech. Firstly, on why this is economically unviable. Secondly, why the comparative is just much better. And thirdly, on geopolitics and why this just gets much worse under their side. Firstly though, I want to do a little bit of setup. First thing I want to explain is what does Australia mine? I would suggest that this is not the lithium that is used in batteries. This is majoritarily produced in China. Those are just where the mines are. But it is instead things like trace elements that you need a high purity of. I don't really know what that is, but my teammates tried to explain it to me. The second thing is just to point out this is a sports motion, which means that they do not have the to explain, to say that this goes well. I would suggest instead this is quite a high burden thing for them to do, and that is for 4 reasons. The first is just to explain this, as they explain, is just an incredibly bad policy for the environment. And that is to explain that manufacturing is just really bad. Like, for example, it is very energy intensive because you have to heat up the minerals a lot in order to melt them down. But you also have to do things like dump a lot of waste into the environment. And obviously that is really bad for a few reasons, right? Firstly, because you have a lot of internal pushback. For example, look at the protests against the Adani mines that occurred in Australia. But second, you just have a lot of external pushback. Things like the Paris Agreement that Australia has signed up to are obviously going to be very disfavored when they sign up for this. But the second thing is just to explain this obviously costs a lot. They explain that it costs a lot intuitively, right? By the point that they're saying that governments would subsidise this to quite a great degree. But obviously in Australia, things like infrastructure are just much more expensive. You have to hire workers that just are paid a lot better and do things like have a lot of protections of workers, and that is very expensive. But the third is just to explain that there is just a lot of skepticism of the manufacturing industry in Australia. Obviously the closure of the car industry in Australia that happened quite recently means that a lot of people do not want to go into manufacturing, and that is noticeable because you see a shift in the Australian economy since then to being more service. We have a very large university sector, we have a very large service sector. But the fourth reason is obviously you're going to have pushback from China. This is quite obvious. But that just means that it's going to be quite hard in order to instate this in the first place. What do we support in the alternative then? I would suggest the alternative is exactly what Australia is doing now, which is just a massive increase in renewables. Why is this exclusive? 4 reasons. Why can we support this? 4 reasons. The first is just to say, obviously, Australia is tending towards this in a political direction. The Labor government is trying to enter into more climate agreements, so obviously there is a capacity or an incentive to do this. But second, again, Australia is a service economy. It has a huge uni sector. It has lots of innovation. I would suggest the CSIRO is trying to work on more of this. But third, there's just a lot of climate push forward, both internally and externally. And the fourth thing is just to say that this is kind of a profitable thing. You obviously have a lot of first mover advantage when you're the first person to come up with this new technology that is incredibly awesome and that lots of people want to use a lot. So obviously there is capacity and incentive for Australia to do this. I would suggest that this is mutually exclusive because when you pursue one energy policy, it is in tension with the other policy. The last is just to explain that the third thing is just to observe though that in the world more places are starting to refine rare earth minerals, and that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's just in the interests of many places, for example South America and West Africa are trying to produce more minerals, and that is because they've recently shifted from being more an agricultural society to being more of a production and manufacturing society. But secondly, things like the war in Iran, things like a lot of instability that has occurred because of Ukraine have just pushed people to be more energy conscious. For example, the ASEAN grid is being trying to be pushed to be produced right now. Okay, first argument on why this is economically unviable in the long term. First thing is just to explain, obviously this has a huge startup cost, right? The production of all of these mines is going to, all of these refineries is just going to be incredibly expensive. And you should note that this is particularly true because the level of refining that has to occur in order to produce these rare earth minerals is quite large. It probably looks like having a lot of initial investment by the government, billions to hundreds of billions, even, of dollars into this thing. But the second is just that their long-term even if we cop that, and even if they're we'll just outweigh this in the long term, the long-term investment is just really bad, and that's because you obviously have to continually maintain these facilities and have workers to do that. And they pretty much concede this when they explain that the government probably has to subsidize this to a really large extent. And that just means that in the long term, it's just going to be quite bad. And the reason here is because the competition from China and other nations that are starting to build their manufacturing industries is just really bad. Firstly, they obviously have lower environmental regulations, which reduces the cost of any processing. They probably also have lower regulations just in general, which just means workers are much cheaper to hire. The third reason is that they just have a much better comparative advantage. They've been doing it for longer, and notably in China, they already have sectors of technology innovation that support this refinery, which means they can do it quicker and cheaper and just undercut Australia, no matter how many subsidies that the Australian government gives. The comparative here is either the Australian government has to give so many subsidies in order to undercut China and for these countries to actually buy these minerals, or that you do not get these minerals bought in the first place. But the final thing is obviously China has just massive economies of scale. They already have so much control over that. Obviously you have to be comparative. They give a bunch of reasons as to why maybe the timeline and things is better. But even if corporations under their world maybe don't pay as much tax, the corporations in Australia pay more tax comparatively than corporations in China. And thus you should probably weigh that. The impact of here is just to explain that there would have to be continual subsidies from the Australian government, or these minerals are just really uncompetitive. Both sides are obviously bad. One is an opportunity cost for the Australian people, the other is an opportunity cost for the other countries that are buying these minerals. The third thing just to explain though is obviously this does things like increase geopolitical tensions, which means that countries such as the countries in West Africa, countries in Southeast Asia, do not have the want to buy these rare earth minerals because they get pushed back from China. Okay, the impacts of this argument is first, in their best case, like maybe Australia is able to produce some sort of industry here, but there's obviously huge harms to it. Like there's a massive sunk cost here that they could be using into green energy instead. Instead, they have to use it to subsidize the mining industry, and that's particularly bad. But you still have a lot of countries trying to buy from China and West Africa because those are the countries that just have the competitive advantage to such a massive degree that any sort of government subsidy cannot undercut that. But in their worst case, it looks like, for example, the collapse of the mining refinery industry as a whole, just like what happened with the car industry just a few years ago. Like this is clearly what is going to occur. The comparative here, we would suggest is twofold. The first is just you've got much better energy diversification on our side, and the framing here is that currently there is a lack of innovation from the service economy to actually creating renewables, and that's simply because obviously the mining industry has an incentive here, and they just increase that incentive of the mining industry. We decrease that incentive asymmetrically, and we just explained that we increase renewables for a few reasons. Obviously, I did a lot of this work in setup, but this is just a good thing for a few reasons. The first is just more innovations just equals more options in the market. That just makes renewables much cheaper for people to afford. That is really good. But the second is you just get a lot of better options. Like you get different types of options. Maybe some solar panels only work in wet places and others only work in dry places. Just good to have lots of options. The third is that you shift the narrative to going towards renewables. In their side, Australia shifts the narrative to like, oh, we should produce more rare earth minerals. We do the opposite. The way in here is quite simple. The scale can be marginal for a very big impact because obviously renewable technology is very new. So any additional innovation here is very important. And the impact here is really clear. First, we just get more energy as a whole. That is an incredibly good thing. But second, we just get better, cleaner energy because if you weigh it, like renewables are just cleaner than the rare earth minerals that they get. And obviously that is directly comparative to the argument that they explained. But the second argument we have here is just to say that China gets cheaper and better energy. The first is that China obviously has the capacity to produce this really cheaply. I've already explained this argument. But second, China has an incentive to like diversify and ship this to different places. The first is because it's in their interest to break the Western hegemony. Like they're already doing this by producing and exporting it a lot to West Africa, producing and exporting it a lot to Southeast Asia. Like for example in Vietnam, like for example in Indonesia, which just explains that they probably want to export these minerals. But second, obviously there's a massive profit incentive for China to do this. So it's unlikely they're going to be really unstable if this is the main way that their economy actually gets money and the main way that the government is able to sustain their agenda into the future. Our side is just much better for two reasons. First, we just have so much more energy within the market. But second, energy is just much more accessible. And I think that this is the main point of weighing, right? Like, this is how people eat. This is how people go to their jobs. This is how people sustain themselves. Having energy in the market is important. Having cheap energy that people can access is just incredibly important.
We'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that fine speech and invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the affirmative case. Hear. You may, but it will also be video recorded and put on YouTube.
Oh yeah,
so
that's fine.
You might not need to.
Okay, I'll just voice record so I can watch after the round. That's all right.
I think you need to leave that with me, but
Yes.
yeah, that's fine.
Airplane mode on and voice mode.
I like that you've not named a single one of these. Cool. Whenever you're ready, second affirmative.
This is not an active debate. The problem with rare earth minerals right now, status quo, is not the fact that China produces it cheap. We wouldn't be having this debate if it's true. The problem is that price competition for rare minerals exceeds beyond the price. It involves geopolitics. It involves the weaponization of a large actor that tries to maximize its profit and geopolitical hegemony in the region. Australia has a unique opportunity to break through this hegemony and allows for greater access of rare earth minerals across the world for the sake of technology and for renewable energy. The first issue I want to deal with in this speech is whether or not Australia can do this well. Negative has two claims to this. The first is to say Australia probably has very little amounts of trace amounts of rare earth minerals, so therefore it's not going to happen. I think second and third are going to expand on this as well. What I would say is that you can't look at the percentage of how much 8% is. You have to look at the numbers of this. And 8% of global production and global supply is just millions and millions of tons of rare earth resources. Maybe they are trace amounts, but these trace amounts amalgamate into thousands and hundreds of thousands of tons that Australia is able to export every year. I would know these are things that are just growing over time. So China is not using its full 80% in the global market, but also at the same time, I would say minor amounts are sufficient for a lot of things that we use right now, because rare earth minerals are seen in small semiconductor chips. Rare earth minerals are used inside batteries as they concede as well. Rare earth minerals power a lot of high-end technology using small amounts, which means the 8% is also still quite a large thing. The second thing we say is that you actually create a prerequisite to access alternative markets as well. So maybe Australia has 8%, but the rest of the world, like Indonesia and Malaysia, where I'm from, has just large amounts of rare earth minerals as well that make up the rest of the world's 20%. Australia's ability to develop an industry in their own backyard and that's closer to these places as well also enables the option for them to option to, while they are vertically integrating, also export their raw materials to Australia and also to be able to develop it as well. The second claim that they have is that this is economically bad. The first thing I want to deal with is all of their claims of, oh, mining is bad, is just not true, and is not politically unpopular right now. Firstly, mining generates a lot of domestic jobs. As they say, the service industry in Australia is just depleting at the same time. Manufacturing and rare earth extraction is just actually a growing industry, as how a lot of individuals work in mine generation and extraction as well. Secondly, I would say Australia actually has a really strong and long history of resource refinery as well. Australia is a net importer of natural gas from countries like Indonesia and like Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. Australia also has domestic oil refinery firms as well. They are quite stabilized. The debate is just about whether or not Australia should open up an additional refinery for a new industry that diversifies its existing portfolio. We say that's fair because the question that you have to ask yourself is how expensive this would be, because it seems like a negative is just worried about the cost, but they don't explain how big and severe that is. Firstly, I would say Australia actually right now does not need to have a high upfront cost into the industry. If you look at last week's USU pre-Australs motions, Lynas is an Australian refinery plant operating in Malaysia, which would assume that Australia probably has the institutional technology and knowledge to be able to develop its own refinery plants in the region as well. Secondly, this is a huge industry. As Negative concedes, there's large amounts of inelastic demand for a lot of rare earth minerals that we will also explain exceeds beyond price competition, because their claim is that there's no demand for Australia to enter into because China is really cheap. That doesn't respond to the claims that Abby gave to you in the first speech, as well China has systemically locked out a lot of large producers of technology in the market as well. South Korea and Japan are the largest drivers of AI revolution and data centers. These are ones who require large amounts of semiconductors that China has not given them access to. Australia is the most proximate actor who is able to give to them. Europe is just being handheld by China precisely because China is the only exporter for Europe when it comes to rare earth materials, which means there's growing demand for domestic EU industries. They're growingly anti-China because of the trade imbalance China has with them to want to diversify their portfolio and diversify the energy sources that they're able to retain. What this means is that there's demand in the market. What this does in Iran is that it attracts significant amounts of private investment that we do see. That's why Lynas has preferential access in Southeast Asia, because there's connections in Southeast Asia. That's why Lynas has plants in America, because there's access to American tech firms that are also able to sign exclusive deals with them specifically. What this means to Iran is just that Australia can leverage the private market well, but also at the same time the cost is not just that high. The second thing they say is, alternatively, let's invest in renewable technology. Firstly, they don't have different political capital this is different political capital. The support motion, they can't just say we have the fiat to explain and counter it prop. I would say investment in renewable technology is different from investment into rare earth refineries, precisely because rare earth refineries supports the mining industry and mining jobs that are non-renewable, versus renewable energy of them supports like green energy and green advocates that advocate for these types of policies at the end of the day. It's a different industry. But I would say as well, there's no opportunity cost to investing both at the same time. Renewables are increasing in demand. Manufacturing is just on the boom in Australia, precisely if they say that the service economy is low, which means that large amounts of demand to build wind turbines, build solar panels, have engineers in these factories to be able to pump up the industry. It's just equally in Australia's incentive to do so well. Australia is a fucking rich country, guys. Like, you guys undersell your own country for your own wars. But I would say This is actually a priori good for us because as both sides agree, renewable technology and renewable batteries require rare earth minerals to function in the first place. In order for Australia to develop renewable energy and technology, the status quo is that you extract mineral ores, you ship it to China, you incur that shipping cost for China to refine it, and then you buy it from China again. Like obviously this is just cost ineffective for a lot of the renewable energy market that Australia wants to develop as well. We get that priority first because we have a domestic supply chain that reduces on increases in economies of scale, reduces in transportation costs, increases in price stability because it is insulated from global supply chain shocks. All of these benefits explain why their counterfactual actually only exists on their side of the house. The final thing that they say is that you're likely going to be pissed. So the second issue I want to do is specifically China. The first thing I want to talk about is whether or not Australia is going to piss China off as a result of this and lead to worse global geopolitical issues. Firstly, this is untrue. The Chinese economy needs the Australian economy, and the Australian economy is deeply integrated with the Chinese economy on both sides of the house. China demands and imports large amounts of Australian goods like manufacturing and meat and grain, precisely because that's how they keep the domestic markets flowing. Secondly, even if you do not believe in that, China also is a net exporter to a lot of places globally for them to keep their currency low. So just because Australia doesn't ship their rare minerals there, doesn't mean that China is likely going to be affected or negatively fucked by that as much as well. Thirdly, Australia actually has a lot of things that they trade with China as well. Like Australia can negotiate for iron ores to be shipped in larger amounts of quantities. Australia can negotiate for renewable tech transfers to China if that's what they want as well. The point is that Australia and China can give and take what they need. What we explain specifically is that rare earth is something that we want to keep rather than give to China because of the strategic economic advantage that we have in the realm. Is it good that China continues to be the only actor that supplies rare earth materials to the rest of the world? I think in Abby we already gave you significant analysis as to why China is just a large actor which maybe can provide cheap rare earth minerals to a lot of countries. The problem is that the ones that develop rare earth technology, use rare earth technology to the most economically efficient ones like Japan and Korea and the EU and the West do not have access to Chinese rare earth minerals to the greatest extent, precisely because China is just a really benevolent actor. But also at the same time, China's hegemony is exactly what entrenches high amounts of prices. If there's no alternative option, China is the only one who can sell to all these places, and if demand is inelastic, China can price gouge to a larger extent, and that's why there's a necessity for Australia to enter into the market. Abby already explains why the global supply chain is far more secure that they do not respond to. I'm going to explain to you why this is good for Southeast Asia and smaller and middle powers. Because Southeast Asia right now does not have significant refinery capacity as well. It takes 20 years for Indonesia's nationalization downstreaming policy to even take into effect for large industries to occur. The problem is that dependency on China for refinery is just limiting and minimizing their options and their abilities to access other markets because all of your refined material goes to Chinese EVs, Chinese chips, which reduces and significantly restricts you from the Western market like Nvidia and Intel and Microsoft. What we say is that on our side of the house, Australia is the most proximate actor to Southeast Asia that now has developed refinery capacity that enables Southeast Asia to pick and choose which market they want to enter into, diversify it, but also at the same time allows them to hitch on that price, and finally at the same time cooperate with Australia to a far greater extent when it comes to tax transfers and expediting their downstreaming capacity because Australia does it first. That's why we're so proud to affirm.
Jan?
Yes. Thank you. I should have stopped there.
We'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that fine speech, sorry, the second affirmative speaker, and now invite the second negative speaker to continue the negative case. Hear, hear. God, that's so many pages.
Yeah, it's quite a few. Oh, you?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
So in 3, 2, 1.
First on the countercrop, then on the capacity, then on diversification, and then on the environment. First, just quickly on the countercrop. All Young's analysis seems to explain that the countercrop is likely to just be that Australia invests in the existing infrastructure in like Malaysia or Singapore, which seems to just be far more efficient and far more of a net good because you're investing in things that already exist, which they explain at first why that's so good. Thanks for that analysis. Then on stabilising the global market and Australia being able to do it well. I am just going to go through the next one by one because when you look at them for 2 seconds, they're all exceedingly weak. The first is time and proximity in that you're geographically close to the rare earth resources. Firstly, this is kind of uncomparative because China also has their own rare earth resources. But secondly, it's just fucking tiny and nebulous. But particularly when you then ship the refined rare earth minerals overseas anyway, it's just so unclear why the shipping cost is so great when you're compared to like the massive amount of cost it takes to do mining, equipment, explosives, the refinery of rare earth minerals. That's exceedingly small. Secondly, economies of scale. Obviously, they know this is silly. China has far greater economies of scale than Australia. There aren't diminishing returns for economies of scale. When you have a 1.4 billion person, biggest economy in the world, the economies of scale are just like substantially greater, and actually I would argue that economies of scale are exponential, such that when you get to a certain contiguous size of that amount, you can just have massive amounts of refinery, you can invest far more in that. That economy of scale is obviously uncomparative. They say we already have refineries, but these are not rare earth refineries, they are different kinds of refineries. They point to crude oil and coal. But I would point out these are different types of resources, and that's because coal and oil, you literally just burn. Oil is a liquid and rare earth minerals are solids. Sorry if that's a simple meg. But also, I would note that rare earth minerals require particularly high level, sophisticated refinery. And that's because they are more reactive. They often process into more sophisticated materials because they're used in things like semiconductors, but also because of the volatility of them, they require more safety, they require more specific infrastructure, which Australia does not have. They say the private market is interested and there are low corporate taxes, but this is so obviously uncomparative. There is obviously more of a private market interest in China, and obviously China is more pro-free market because they've spent the last 30 years trying to expand their economy, particularly into the tech industry, which explains that everything they say about Australia having private market and subsidy interest and government support is obviously so much better in China. They barely respond to our actual megs. They strawman it and say all we said is Australia doesn't have many rare earth minerals. That was never the claim. Check your notes. I'm talking about diversification in China. Why is this never the tipping point for diversification? China is also the #1 importer of these from everywhere else. I think this is OIV, but the structural reason for this is a fewfold. China has the greatest need domestically as the world's largest economy and also a tech-heavy economy. China has been investing heavily in specifically the tech transition for decades. They want to compete with semiconductors, to compete with Taiwan, etc. But also thirdly, they're one of few countries, and often the only country, that has the capital to buy all your rare earth minerals at once, which means both better deals and less friction costs, when other countries can just sell all their rare earth minerals to one country, which means every other country ships basically all their excess rare earth materials to China. And this explains that China monopolizes this. Now I would point out that they actually rely on China monopolizing this for them to get any benefit to diversification. Because if China doesn't have a monopoly, then what is the benefit of diversification? They spend their entire case saying China does have a monopoly and imports all the rare earth minerals from literally everywhere else. At this point, this is so likely to be a tipping point. Because Australia's 8%, which is, by the way, most likely less if you believe that Australia doesn't actually have the domestic capacity to process all 8% with natural resources, is just never enough to unentrench China's monopoly, because China literally has a monopoly on 100% of the production. Like, an 8% being a free market is just such a nebulous benefit. And I would point out that this is the tipping point, though, that's onto cheaper exports, that harming other countries. And that is to say that even if 8% never fixed a monopoly, it did hurt profit margins. And that's for a few reasons. Firstly, because a reduction in imports creates unused facilities and refineries. Like, they've previously been refining all these rare earth minerals, now they aren't. Secondly, because they either have to scale up domestic mining or be more demanding of another country in order to replace the vacuum of the mined rare earth minerals that they previously had, which means there are friction costs to this, there are startup costs to this, there's political time delay to this from having to pressure other countries. But also thirdly, intuitively, in any industry, particularly at national and government level, 8% is just a large cut to profits. Like 8% in any industry, if you've ever looked at a book, and you looked at a budget sheet, 8% is huge for China. But note, this never unentrenched the monopoly. What it did do is it just means that it reduces the amount China is willing to pay other countries for these rare earth minerals. And note for economies like Brazil, like Senegal, the ones that rely on these exports, note two things. The first is that these countries can never escape China. That's for the reasons that they tell you. Firstly, because they massively rely on China elsewhere in their economy, because they are just incredibly dependent on China as their largest trade partner. I think it's OIV that more than half the countries in the world, and all the countries that export these rare earth minerals, their largest trading partner by so far is China, which means they cannot so simply pull back. And that's for two reasons. The first is fear of economic retaliation. Now, I'll explain why that's likely later.
later, but we know that China is prone to this. In response to the Trump tariffs, they sent counter tariffs. In response to Australia taxing Chinese wine, they put a bunch of luxury taxes on Australia over something as small and petty as fucking wine taxes. Like, obviously there is massive fear of economic retaliation, and China has an incentive to keep creating this fear to entrench their dominance. But secondly, these deals and sectors and economies have lock-in contingent deals. That is to say, they sign contracts to say you export all your rare earth minerals to us for the next 30 years. Or they say, as a condition of us selling you X product, you have to sell us Y product, being the rare earth minerals. And China particularly does this often, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, because they have the incentive to retain their dominance of the economy. And secondly, because they have a bargaining imbalance with all these other nations from a trade perspective, which allows them to do things like lock them in the long term. It allows them to do things like hinge their exports, say we won't give you our massive economy and access to our massive economy if you don't sell us their rare earth minerals. But the second broad reason is for fear of political tension. China is really fucking scary. You don't want to piss them off. You don't want to have inflamed political tensions with China for fear of retaliation. And what this means is countries structurally can't switch their exports away from China. And even if they did want to, or even if they could switch their exports away from China, they wouldn't want to for fear of economic retaliation, for fear of political retaliation. But no, even if you don't believe that, 8% of rare earth minerals is just not that much. Like, it just was never an actual benefit to diversification. Sure, Australia has two major supermarkets. Aldi fucking exists, but there's still massive price gouging from Coles and Woolworths, a duopoly. At 92% of the global monopoly never made a difference to monopolization. It always made a difference to how much countries had to pay. And the second thing to note here under this is that these are very weak, thin economies in countries like Senegal, in countries like Brazil, which are the other ones that export the rare earth minerals to China. Which means even an 8% reduction in the amount China is willing to pay for the thing that they hinge their economy on cripples these economies. They rely on China. They rely on China paying the maximum amount they can for these rare earth minerals. That reduction was huge. The only reason for why Australia entering the market was good is because China price gouges. But I've explained that China always wants maximum profit, and they have the bargaining power imbalance, which should suggest to you that what China does under status quo is they pay countries the absolute minimum they can for countries to still export them the rare earth minerals under status quo. This does not change when Australia enters the market, because China always wanted to maximize their profit. They always had the bargaining imbalance to maximize their profit, which meant they just always did this anyway. China does want profit. They do want to get the rare earth minerals. Like, it's just so unclear why this is the tipping point for this. They say supply chains, China's obviously cheap because of economies of scale. Let's talk about the environment. They say production in China is bad, but the overarching response here is two pieces of framing. The first is the large majority of environmental and labour harms occur at the mining stage, not the refinery stage. That's because when you're actually digging into the ground, that's because when you're using explosives, that's when you're using dangerous equipment, that's when you're burning fuels to power mining equipment. And the second piece of framing here is Australia currently mines rare earths, but does not refine them. I think this is OIV, but also the info slide tells you Australia is a large producer, not refiner of rare earth minerals, and it also tells you structurally, refining is higher tech, China dominates tech for all the reasons we already told you. Conversely, China both mines and refines, which what this suggests to you is that when Australia continues to mine rare earths, but not now refines them themselves, China has a vacuum of rare earths that must be filled from somewhere. Firstly, to fill their refinery capacity, and secondly, because they need rare earths. And what this means is, in response, China either scales up their own production or imports more from other countries. And as Af tells you, environmental regulations in Australia are the world's best, which means wherever else they produce, that is environmentally worse when China scales up their own production. The second observation is their explanation of why political capital against mining is so high in Australia. Explains that there is likely to be a lot of friction or pushback to this policy, or it is likely to be swiftly undone, in which case you accrue all the short-term harms but none of the long-term benefits.
Speaker for that fine speech, and invite the third affirmative speaker to close off the substantive speeches for side affirmative. Hear, hear.
this team is stuck in symmetricity. I'm really confused about their strategy of victory because we never needed Australia to become the global leader in the market or destroy Chinese competition. All we needed is another option in the market to unlock all the benefits we explained at first, a rebuttal or any rebuttals they never give. Their case, TLDR, is that they explain that here are a series of reasons why it is unlikely to be successful in a large degree and provide a lot of mitigation. But we explained that our burden was to explain that when you have the option of Australian refining, the benefits we accrue are global, even if we have to cop some benefits to the Chinese economy or cop some cost to the Chinese economy or to the Australian economy. Firstly, the first positive contribution at one end is to explain that renewable energy is a better counterfactual and Australia is likely to miss out on the renewable energy you get. There are three problems with this argument. First, it is not mutually exclusive. The shallow one-liner at one end is, well, it is in tension with other forms of energy policy, which is blatantly untrue. Australia still uses coal, for example. It refines coal to make it energy sufficient. Energy policy in every nation is to balance different forms of energy with each other. Why? Because obviously renewable energy is not at a level where you can sustain your entire economy's energy uses with renewable energy only, which explains why most countries actually balance the types of energy policies they have, which means there is no mutually exclusive cost on our side in order to why renewable energy cannot be pursued by the Australian population. The second problem with this argument is that reduction in mining is never going to happen on their side. The mining bloc in Australia is the strongest bloc in Australia. Companies like BHP lobby both the Labour government and the Liberal government, which means it is unlikely that they would ever get a reduction in mining. Thirdly, their I think best mechanism is to explain that, well, if you have a subsidy opportunity cost on these farms, maybe you cannot subsidize renewable energies as well. That is, I think, the best explanation. But even in that explanation, there are two problems. Problem number one, obviously the types of subsidies we would give these companies on our side are not to set up upfront costs. The types of subsidies they would get most likely, because the Australian population already dislikes things like giving large upfront cost subsidies, means that the types of subsidies these companies get are a after-profit subsidy, which means instead of taxing them at a 25 or 30% regular level, maybe you would tax them 15 or 20%, which might mean there is a reduction in the government revenue, but there is no money that is coming out of the Australian pocket to begin with. Actually, we would explain that when these companies do set up in Australia as a part of this motion, you actually get greater amount of revenue because these companies are generating profit and therefore probably paying taxes to the Australian government, which means that cannot work for them either. Fifthly, I think they really misidentify which are the companies that are likely to set up in Australia in the first place, which explains why all of their stuff at 2N being like, oh well, maybe Australia, maybe the CCP gives more subsidies and has lesser taxes, does not work for them. First, we will explain that the companies that set up in Australia are likely to be companies from Japan, South Korea, etc. Why is this the case? One, they have an incentive for vertical integration. These are the countries that produce the most amount of semiconductors that are made from the fucking raw earth minerals anyway, which means it is a very good idea for them to both control the raw earth mineral progression and the final product as well, which means they are likely to set up in Australia. And here is where the biggest delta in terms of subsidies, etc., and all of this exchange is in the debate. In Australia, international firms have to pay lesser taxes and lesser taxes in comparison to China. Only Chinese firms get the benefits and the tax cuts they talk about on their side. On our side, the Australian government does not tariff foreign companies. Obviously, this was OIV. Chinese companies have a tendency and a revealed preference. CCP only gives these things to their cronies, or I guess Chinese companies, which means those are companies that would set up in Australia but would never be able to set up in China because they don't want it and they would make it increasingly difficult, which means at the end of this clash, the upshot is very simple. First, the impact here is that it would be cheaper for South Korea, Japan, etc. to set up in Australia because they would not have to pay the ridiculous amount of taxes and tariffs that they would have to pay because they're foreign firms in China. Number two, this deletes all of their mitigation at 1N and 2N, explaining that it is going to be cheaper in production in China. Maybe it will be cheaper for the Chinese firms, not for the other firms. What are the benefits we get from this? Number one, and this is something they never get out of, even if China remains the 90% controller of the economy, the fact that South Korea and Japan are no longer buying from them means that they have to reduce the cost. 2N's explanation explanation is here are a set of countries and why they are not likely to buy from Australia. I am absolutely fine with that. Obviously, as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative and loans that countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka have, they will never choose another country over China because they're going to be politically fucked over. But China has to reduce the prices for those countries as well on both sides of the house when they have an additional player in the market, which means that reduction in prices was huge for us. Why was this the case? Secondly, note that the final price of production is the most important discussion in the debate. Maybe they can produce cheaper, and we never explained we needed to produce cheaper than China. All of that economies of scale stock is useless. What we wanted to explain is that the final product cost was going to be lesser on our side because price gouging on the raw material level could not be done. So I'll ground this example because economics debates can become very confusing. Now on their side, China can ask for whatever price they want from South Korean and Japanese companies when they sell their raw materials to make semiconductors. On our side, they have another option, which means semiconductor prices for those companies in Japan and South Korea reduce, which means they can pass off that cost to consumers to become more competitive in the market. Huge benefit on that. Let's now talk about the environment. Their claim is that, well, environmental protection is likely to not happen. You will not get a big benefit of the environment. But we would just point out that they agree that Australia has the biggest amounts of environmental regulations, which means the production in Australia is likely to be a lot more environmentally beneficial compared to everywhere else. Why is this a huge benefit? I think one, I would point out that most of the waste storage in China happens in places like the Uyghur region, where they have the biggest waste dump because that is the population that they don't give a fuck about, which means those parties are a lot harmed on their side. Secondly, the environmental degradation is a type of thing that affects everyone no matter where it happens. So if you degrade the environment in China, obviously people in India, Bangladesh, Nepal are also affected by the air pollution that happens there. Because environmental regulations are better in Australia, we get a huge benefit because the environment is better on our side. Toxic waste management is better. Those are huge benefits we got on side Affirmative. The last thing they say is that, well, there will be a lot of geopolitical tension. The first is that I'm unclear about what this means. If they're counterfactual, is that Australia goes to countries like Malaysia or Singapore, they still have to eat the environmental regulation argument we have because the same mechanisms would apply, so their environmental protections would be worse. Secondly, we would just explain that CCP going to countries like Western Africa or Southeast Asia is incredibly perverse. They're like, oh, they want to break the Western hegemony. And I'm like, why the fuck do they want to make profit for anyone else and not for themselves? The CCP is notoriously selfish in those days, and I think that's just OIV, which means they only go to those countries if they can pervasively accrue benefits from those nations. For example, giving really bad minimum wages, exploiting working conditions, etc., which are avoided on our side as well. We won this debate twice on two fronts. First, we gave everyone in the world cheaper semiconductor prices, which brought down the prices of your laptop that you're noting on. Secondly, we made the environment better, which means the air that you're breathing would be a lot better as well. Proud to affirm.
We'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for that fine speech, and now it's the third negative speaker to close off with some standard speeches. You're here.
as this team identifies, Australian mining companies like FMG are already setting up refinery plants in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. They could be setting up refineries in places like Brazil that have far more reserves than the measly 5% that Australia has. So the question then is, what's the delta in this debate? And I think the only thing opposition can point to is that you would produce these rare earth minerals in Australia in a far more green and environmentally friendly way, as opposed to the far cheaper production and the setting up of refinery companies by Australian firms in other nations that would just be far more effective and give you far more bang for your buck and more value and just flood the market even better. I can co-opt all of their benefits. Let's first talk about the biggest clash in this debate, access to rare earths. They prove, I think they do a good job proving that if Australia could break in, then they would stabilise the market. But I don't think they ever reach this tipping point. So let's first unpack the premise of will Australia be able to meaningfully increase their production. The first thing I want you to note here is that first, they give you a lot of setup as to how Australia, like China has such a huge hegemony, they have like 80%, Australia has nothing. So you would need a huge increase to like 20, 30 to 40% of Australian minerals in order to break this hegemony, in order to stop China from being able to price gouge. They try to walk this back a bit and say, no, it's just about getting another option in the market later at third, but I just don't think this is true. Just note how high the burden they have to reach is to stop China from being able to price gouge things, because you just do have to not have a majority. Like even if China retains control at 50 to 60%, that still enables them to price gouge. Okay, what do then they say about why Australia can compete? The first thing they say is that they reduce the timeline because Australia mines minerals and then can refine them in the same place. But just no, they themselves admit it's 5% like reserves, right? So they still have to import from places like Indonesia and Malaysia. This timeline still accrues, this is a silly bet. The next thing they say is that you can just do this far more cheaply, and the reason they say is that Australia already finds a lot of things like natural gas. I would just ask what Australia refines this natural gas into. The reason Australia imports natural gas is because our fucking shitty export companies sell the natural gas to other countries for far cheaper than they would sell it in Australia, so that's why we have to import it. I would actually empirically say that Australia exports things like iron ore. Instead of refining it into steel, they export, like our biggest export is iron ore to places like China, because refining in Australia has historically just been such a shit show, because it costs so much, because of the labour costs, because of all the things we point to. Okay, what do we tell you then that is completely unresponded to? We just tell you that the labour costs of this are so high. That's because Australia has a labour government. Australia has historically huge union power. That means you have to pay so much people so much. The standard of education and living is so high. People expect huge wages. But it's just the environmental regulations that this team fucking table taps every time that mean it's so expensive to refine here in Australia. That's because you just are not allowed to just dump the waste. You have to process the clay, you have to reuse it. These are environmental regulations that often go overboard and are just too prohibitive on these companies that mean it is just so much cheaper. And for you to believe that they have any benefit in this debate, you must believe that these regulations impose a huge burden on these companies. This looks like things like wherein the way mining works is you go into the earth, you pick up a bunch of clay that has 1% yttrium in it, and what you do is you then filter through all that clay. Firstly, that filtering process just means you have 99% of a waste product. That's huge, you have to deal with it. We should believe that these environmental regulation costs then, because of that, just are so huge. What that means then is it is just so fucking expensive to do this in Australia. What is the comparative? You would and empirically already do just invest in doing this overseas, in countries where people don't have to be paid as much. And this is not these workers are getting paid less, that's bad. No, it's just because Australia has such a shit, fucking cost of living that you have to pay workers so high, things like that, right? That's fine. We're happy to offshore things like this. The comparative here is just you get so much more bang for your buck because you have these fixed costs being far less. You don't have to adhere to these environmental regulations that are often just overly stringent. This means when companies like FMG just simply invest in other nations like Malaysia or Indonesia, they're going to do refining there for so much cheaper because they don't have all these costs. What is their one response to this? They say they will just subsidise this because Australia is really rich. Unfortunately, this is empirically false. Australia is constantly in a deficit. We just don't receive tax from these resource companies. That means you're losing out double, right? You're setting up more companies that don't pay you tax, but you have to build shit tons of money into them to make them ever profitable. And let's think about what this looks like. Say China is able to export these for $1,000 per kilogram. Australian companies probably have to spend $1,500, $1,600, $2,000 per kilogram on these minerals. That's a huge fucking subsidy the Australian government now has to burden. And note how all of these things are inelastic. That is, labour costs always remain high. The environmental regulations don't get wound back like this team says. That means that you're constantly having to subsidise literally 50% of the fucking price at least of your minerals to match Chinese exports. That's horrific. That's so much money that you have to pump into that to make this profitable. That's ridiculous. Obviously, the comparative where you invest in nations where you're able to just do this far cheaper is so good. The final myth they have here is that international firms pay less tax in Australia than in China. Fine, maybe that's true, but compare this to other nations in the world. Australia has a high corporate tax rate of like 35%. Albo literally just increased it. Countries like Indonesia and Malaysia have far lower corporate tax rates to encourage things like FDI. We would far just prefer to do that. What is the effect of this? This just means you would get so many more rare earth minerals just by allowing private companies to invest in other places rather than forcing them like this team would to invest in Australia. That just means you get far more production, so we would meet them on that burden alone. But I think this is twofold, because then we just get access to all the money that the government would be subsidising otherwise. Because opposition says, it's not a mutually exclusive counterfactual. But obviously in the case that we have an Australian government that is spending far less money, they just would empirically spend that on other things. Why do we tell you that's so good? Because it just does look like investment in the R&D that unlocks the benefits that this team requires. Australia already has a comparative advantage on that. Obviously, it would be far better to have us invest in our university sector and actually build the solar panels that you need these rare earth minerals in the first place. Obviously that counterfactual is better. But let's talk about the second premise of this, because even if they were able to prove that Australia was able to break into the market and do this, I just don't think this fixes rare earth minerals. The first thing they claim is that this would stabilize the market because China is particularly volatile. But I just want to mitigate this because they're China bad. I think China kind of good. Obviously China at the moment is trying to increase its soft power. They say that the CCP is selfish, and they just kind of assert this, right? I would say empirically, through things like the BRI, China is trying to improve its soft power and its relationships with the people around it because it wants to create a multipolar world. That is the direct incentive that stops China from price gouging and fucking people over, which is what we see at the moment. Rare earth minerals are not volatile and super expensive at the moment. Things like EVs are cheap, especially when they come out of China at the moment, and that is for the reason that the rare earth market is relatively stable. So I would say then that actually for the vast majority of consumers, for the nations that need to electrify their transport, like nations in Africa, that is a fucking awesome benefit because China has huge soft power incentives to sell cheap rare earth minerals, cheap EVs to these nations. That's fucking awesome. So then what do they have standing at the end of this? Maybe China doesn't export its rare earths at a fair price to South Korea and Japan, but I'm just unclear and uncertain why that is such a harm. Because China can do the circuit manufacturing, China can do the EV manufacturing instead. And finally, if you believe it is just South Korea and Japan that are not importing these instead, then the fucking 8% reserves that Australia is already producing is probably just enough for these markets. If it's just the two countries they can fucking name, then we probably are already meeting this demand. That seems fine. I'm not sure what the harm is there. But finally, if you believe all of the analysis I just gave you in the first premise of this clash, we obviously unlock this benefit far, far more. So therefore, we just flood the market with far more rare earth minerals, and we get far more development. Let's talk briefly about the environment, because I think they try to weigh it really quickly at the end. This is now the only delta in the debate. They say that China just pollutes weaker regions. Maybe that's true, but I would argue that what you should weigh far more importantly is the access of African nations to solar panels, to wind turbines, to electric vehicles that stop them from polluting in their own backyards, that stop them from polluting their rivers and fucking over their drinking water. What you should weigh most in this debate is the island nations in the Pacific that are literally sinking from climate change. Obviously, the side that has far more access to green tech is the side that is going to be better for the environment into the long term. You should weigh that on obviously the scale, because climate change is existential. It fucks over everyone. The small niche harms they point to would accrue in the counterfactual because, these companies would be mining cheaper and they're insignificant. Proud to negate.
We'd like to thank the third negative speakers for that fine speech and also the standard speakers for the great debate so far. We'll now make the negative reply to begin the reply exchange. Here.
First observation I want to make at the top of this speech is that their path to victory solely relies on you believing that Australia has the capacity to firstly actually create these industries in the first place, but second create it to such an extent that it displaces China. Comparatively, we have many paths to victory. We explained to you multiple sorts of comparatives that can occur. We also explained independently of that geopolitical tensions can occur. Empirically, we have many paths to victory, and that is good. But the other observation that I want to make is that their first argument on stabilizing the global market is contingent on believing that Australia can fill the gap. We clearly explained to you why this isn't the case. That's for a few reasons. The first is just responding to what they said, right? Like, they explained to us that maybe the private market fills this gap, and they explained that there are already incentives for the private market to enter because of geopolitical tensions. But we already explained to you that these are not in the interests of private markets. They don't have geopolitical interests. They have economic interests, profit maximizing interests, and to the extent that you believe the legwork they do to explain that there are different refineries that already exist in the status quo, and the extent that we also explain to you that there are many economies that are now shifting to manufacturing, like in West Africa, like in Latin America, then private markets are obviously going to filter into there because they just have the comparative advantage compared to Australia. So it's very unclear as to how this pathway was going to get them to victory. The second thing, though, as they probably seem to concede at first, is that they would do a lot of subsidies. And we explained that this is really bad in terms of setting up the mining industry, because obviously this is incredibly unsustainable. Hamish explained to you that Australia is already in a budget deficit, which means to the extent that they need to continually put in government subsidies to actually have a competitive advantage, in the long term these industries would just fall out. Our comparative here was just much more intuitive and better. They do a lot of the legwork to explain to us that there already is capacity in the status quo for other countries to fill this gap. We explained to you that the private market would fill that gap. We explained to you that there is a natural incentive already and that doesn't need to occur. But even if you believe that Australia may be able to perhaps make some sort of dent into, or just make a refinery industry in the first place, I think that this is kind of tenuous, and they have to support that this is the unique tipping point in order for them to actually break the monopoly. We explain a bunch of reasons as to why this is not the case. The first is just to explain that, obviously, this is just too small of an amount, because they have to explain that every single refined mine they mine up also translates into every minery, and they actually get refined within Australia, which I don't think they ever do sufficiently, because we explain a bunch of reasons as to why that wouldn't be the case. We explain that Australia has a low capacity to do so, the fact that Australia is a service economy and would not have a competitive advantage in these cases. But we also just explain maybe their best claim is that Chinese firms get the most competitive profit, but obviously they still get some sort of profit by being in China, so it's unclear as to why non-Chinese firms actually opt out of the Chinese market in the first place when they're still able to get that competitive advantage. At worst, you believe that the issue with our case is that maybe they just have a short-term lack of comparative advantage, but to the extent that you buy their claims on the environment, you all believe that the cost of production is just so high that this is a long-term cost that they have to cover. What should you buy at the end of this claim then? The first thing is they either have no capacity to actually sustain these refineries in the future, at which all of their benefits are null, but even in their best case, their capacity to produce these minerals are just really bad, firstly, or secondly, the capacity to actually other countries to want to buy these minerals is also low. Places like West Africa have lots of loyalties to China. It's unclear as to why they should. This is clearly explained to you down the bench. Our comparative here is simple. We explain a bunch of reasons as to why China would give these minerals for really at good prices. Firstly, obviously China relies on these countries for the rare earth minerals in the first place, and to the extent that you find that this refinery also occurs in other places, they clearly can't price gouge to such a massive extent. Secondly, China needs to break Western hegemony through things like BRI. But third, obviously, who is China but its people, and they also have that same profit incentive. Empirically, you should observe that in the status quo, these rare earth minerals coming from China are cheap, so it's very unclear as to why they price gouge. I would suggest it is not in their incentives. We also explain, though, that there is another path to victory here, which is that we just got a lot more renewables. They try and say that these are two separate incentives of the government. Note how there's so many lobbying firms in Australia that are solely based on mining to stop renewables. I would suggest that this is an independent path to victory.
We'd like to thank the negative reply speaker for that fine speech. Now I'd like to ask reply to close off the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Negative spends our entire debate missing what we say from first. We tell you that a series of countries right now are not viably engaging with China on the point of their rare earth minerals. China has locked out Korea and South Korea and Japan. Other countries find it too expensive. Countries like Malaysia and Southeast Asia are bullied in their trade agreements. That is what they don't understand. The second thing that they don't understand is that means that someone has to enter the market. And we spend this entire debate telling you that that someone does have to be Australia. There are a set of reasons why it can't be Malaysia, why it can't be Indonesia, why it has to be Australia. That is because we are that much better for the environment. That is because we're better positioned in trade. The first thing that I'm going to deal with is their counterfactual. The first thing that I want to say is this is a false trade-off, because companies, if you believe they're incentivized to go to places like Indonesia, Malaysia, etc., are obviously able to do that and go to Australia. Because what we tell you from first is that this is incredibly inelastic and only getting more inelastic. This is a massively growing economy that will increase for time and time and time. And that means that companies can open up a production plant in Indonesia and can open up a plant in Malaysia. And if you think that's true, then that's an auto W for us, because that's just more market share on all of the things we agree. But it actually is different, and it is a way, because what they don't have on their counterfactual is the Australian government, as per the motion, aggressively growing these industries. And that's the difference, because on their side, they rely on the goodwill of companies that want to enter Malaysia and Indonesia. We say, yes, there are a series of companies who have the incentive to produce and refine rare earth minerals. Now, through massive interventionist policies by the Australian government in an aggressive pursuit, help those companies, give them a financial incentive. And that's the delta in this debate. That's why this can, by the Australian government, mean that countries can enter the market and compete with China. And why they can't do that on their side? These companies in Malaysia and Indonesia face all the problems of their side of startup costs. Doesn't happen on our side because the Australian government is helping. But even if we believe none of that, their counterfactual is worse. It does have to be Australia. We tell you the reason is Australia is better than the environment. Malaysia and Indonesia won't care about this. This is the singular most important thing in this debate, and they have a single response, which is to mitigate and outweigh. But you should not believe this mitigation and outweigh. Things like China having more environmentally bad factories means that people in China breathe in more pollution and get sicker. Things like China having a bigger hole under the ozone means that impacts everyone. And this is important because dragging these minerals out of the earth is symmetric. Yes, it's the most environmentally bad part of it, but it's the most symmetric part of it. What we can change is how these factories operate. At best, at worst, we distribute them more evenly between China and Australia, which is good for the Chinese people, whom there are more of. But at best, we tell you that China has better practices, etc. And that is important. But we just tell you it's even better because Australia has specifically good trade agreements. We tell you Australia is specifically liberalised economically, has good deals with the EU, has good deals with Japan and South Korea. And that is what makes the difference, because on their side, they have a company in Indonesia or Malaysia that's trying to fight. We tell you the second Australia enters the market, the EU comes in. The second Australia enters the market, Japan and South Korea flood it. And that's why the counterfactuals isn't viable, because even if you believe it's true, there is a difference. Why can Australia enter the market at all? To be clear, our burden is different than what they say it is from first. We tell you there are a set of countries that are being bullied by China in the status quo, which means we don't have to be cheaper, we don't even have to be better, because these places have nowhere else to go. They want to buy from Australia. They're begging to buy from Australia. They just can't do it from China. South Korea has to. That means even if it's more expensive, even if it takes 10 years, even if it takes 20 years, they will still buy from Australia. That is how we enter the market. The second we do that, that is when we grow more overall. That is when Australia gets more funding because they actually engage with the market. That is when other countries realize that it's a viable option. Because all they tell you about China bullying people, it's worse on their side of the house. They don't prove it doesn't happen in the status quo. Vote affirmative.
Started. Excellent. Okay, let me set stopwatch. Thank you guys. This was a very good debate. I think it was also a very tight and very technical debate. So it was very enjoyable for us to judge, and we did come to the same read, but I do think it was quite a fun one, and one where the debate was very high quality. I also thought like the mechanization and the specifics of how people engaged each other were also very high quality. I was pretty chuffed overall with the quality of it. One piece of general feedback I would have for at least some speakers is that I am just not a fan of having in your speech like, the ordinary intelligent voter knows this. Because the ordinary intelligent voter is a knowledge standard. It's not a person. And I guess like you can obviously throw things at your judge and be like, you should know this or you should accept this because the OIB knows it. But surely a better thing to do is to just explain what you mean, as you guys often did, and walk through the process of what you were talking about. I don't really think this is like an insta-win for a point to be credited. If other judges are requiring it, those judges are bad. And I don't think it's super helpful. So you're better off dropping that language entirely, I would say. Broadly speaking, I think this was a close but clear debate, and we both shared that view to my knowledge. We gave it to the negative team. I think broadly this debate circles around two questions, with some extraneous stuff that also factors in, but I guess I will say I am not super persuaded that arguments about Australia's interests on the whole are super important in this debate for the reason that, as identified, it's not an active motion. So there are claims about whether or not this is good for Australia or the Australian economy. These obviously are arguments in the debate, but absent weighing as to why we care about Australia more than other countries, or why the number of people in Australia is so great, or it's the world's greatest country, such that we should prioritise it over other things, it ends up being a less important clash to my mind. So I think this debate broadly centres around one, will this policy work? And within that, will this policy last? Which is where I think negative most directly attacks the affirmative team. And secondly, on environmental effects, given how the first clash is resolved. So, will this policy work? Affirmative sets up several impacts that are dependent on the policy working out, and I suppose to some extent dependent on there being a level of competition with China that allows other countries to shift to Australia instead. But broadly speaking, the impacts that they're reaching for are reducing China's leverage over other countries, such as the EU, such as South Korea, such as Japan. Secondly, lowering prices, or at least making it such that China can no longer price gouge on the market, because there is a competitor who can offer a comparable, if not lower price, and therefore China cannot just set the price arbitrarily because demand is inelastic. And thirdly, generally speaking, you'd have more rare earth minerals on the market, which means there are more countries that can make and afford EVs, renewable energy, anything, lithium batteries if necessary, anything which uses REMs or rare earth minerals in order to make them, of which there are quite a lot of things. These are, I think, good and correct impacts. I think they're the right things for AF to be reaching for. In the debate, they're all reliant on the policy working. Working, I guess, to an extent where there are at least some countries that flock to Australia instead, but also on the policy lasting. So I think firstly, on the policy working, the big question I have by the end of the debate is whether private companies do in fact come into Australia, given you guys set it up not as that we think the likeliest thing to happen is that there will be nationalised companies that are going to do it. It's not the Australian government is going to have national companies that are doing it, or state-owned enterprises, but rather the private companies will come in with some degree of support from the Australian government. That's what the aggressive growth looks like, but it will be private companies. Affirmative says foreign firms in China face corporate tax, and there are sort of issues they have in being as profitable as Chinese firms within China, so many of them would want to come to Australia if it was to offer the option to do so. Ned says a couple of things in response. A, that Australia just does not have the infrastructure right now and needs to build it. I think there is a bit of a kerfuffle over Australia's current refining capacity. The claim on AF is that currently there are refineries that exist for natural gas and for oil. The claim on Neg is that those are not fungible in the same way, so that the things you need for a refinery for natural gas and for oil are not the same as you would need for a refinery for rare earth minerals. They are different in what they are doing, so they are designed for different things. You functionally need brand new refineries in order for this to work. I think some of the mex of this are like, natural gas is a gas and oil is liquid, but rare earth minerals are broadly solid. This is perhaps a reason, but the broader reason is probably that you want more particular outcomes and you want very clear and clarified rare earth minerals that are fit to do very precise things, and that generally speaking you will need different kinds of things to do that than you would need to refine oil or refine coal. They're just different things, they refined in different ways. Refineries, while they might do one thing, will not do another thing. And I suppose the OIV knows that oil refineries even have a massive diversity within them. That got a lot of news coverage recently at the point of Venezuela and why the intervention in Venezuela took place, because the kind of oil that Venezuela produces is the kind that the US is very well poised to refine. But there are different levels of how crude oil can be, and levels therefore as to what kind of needs they have in terms of what refineries do for them. So if that is the case, then one mineral, it is, I think, quite intuitive that different minerals will have different needs for refineries, and therefore you can't just translate one into the other as easily as is suggested by AF. Secondly, China has massive economies of scale right now. It is possibly exponential in the ways those massive economies of scale are able to work, because it's just how large China is. But even if you're a foreign firm, it is very profitable within China right now because they have an existing industry on this, it has economies of scale, and they have the largest supply of rare earth minerals, both because they import all of them, but also because they have so many of their own, which means that there are a lot of advantages within China. They never say sunk cost, which I think would have been a perhaps useful mechanism for you of, I'm not quite sure why existing companies would move to Australia if they're in China and things work out very well for them. But I think there are other reasons they suggest as to why China is a good place to be, and you might not want to move to a new and spec speculative industry that is being set up for the first time in another country. Third reason is that Australia is incredibly expensive. There are high environmental regulations. You cannot dump waste, which is conceded by AF and sort of arguments they make about environmental impacts. And employees are also very expensive because there's a high cost of living in Australia and there's high workplace protections, which means that in order to set up or in order to work in Australia, the costs are very high. And fourthly, if you really want to set up refineries somewhere other than China, they suggest you would be better off doing it somewhere other than Australia, so Indonesia or Malaysia, somewhere that is substantially cheaper, does not have the same environmental regulations, does not have the same workplace regulations. I think this comes out a little later down the bench that I would like. If you guys are pushing that there are alternative places that you could do refineries as an alternative and a competitor to China, it would be nice to have had that come out at first, such that we had that very clearly being presented as a likely alternative. But I do think there is not a lot of response to that from AF. And so while I think I agree with you that maybe the environmental regulations are unique to Australia, I'll explain why I don't think those are as debate-winning for you as you think in a little bit. I do also think that the fact that you could go to another place that is cheaper means that I'm not sure the fact of Australia doing this means that this is something that will be flocked to by private companies. So I think there's a big question over whether and to what extent private companies come in, because it is not clear what the advantage is for them or how much risk they're willing to take on when Australia starts doing this, and if they are already existing in other places. Second question is, even if it is implemented and ends up working, will the policy last? There are a couple of things said by 1A, in addition to, I think, a push down the bench about the fact that the level of subsidy required for this, given the high costs in order to be profitable at all in Australia, is just extreme. And I think that is unfortunately something that AF does have to stand over when the wording is aggressive growth. I think there's an attempt at 3A to walk that back a little and say it will be post-profit subsidies, it'll be something that is reasonable. But that, I think, is where this is probably not quite what the motion is requiring you to stand for. The other speakers, I think, do sort of bite the burden of it is going to be a high cost, there's going to be subsidies, we'll do these extreme subsidies anyway. And I think that is the broadly more fair stance for you to take under this motion. But from 1A, we hear, one, this is a bad policy for the environment because it's energy intensive and you will have to dump a lot of waste. Explained later down the bench as when it is the case you have trace elements within Australia and it's maybe 1% of the amount of clay that you're processing to get access to the mineral, 99% of what you end up with as an output of that process is clay. You need to dump that somewhere. You might try to do it sustainably, but you still have to dump it. That is going to lead, as 1A says, to many protests internally, but also a lot of external pressure from things like the Paris Agreement and international agreements that Australia has made surrounding climate stuff. A lot of pressure that means that this will not be popular, in the sense it will be seen as environmentally unfriendly, no matter how hard Australia tries. Secondly, it will be expensive as flagged. The government would have to subsidise it. In particular, if the point for Affirmative is that the purpose of this policy will be to compete with China either by having comparable prices or cheaper prices than China currently has to prevent them from price gouging, given the substantially higher costs within Australia, plus the upfront costs required to set up the industry in the first place. All of this suggests that you would have to have huge amounts of subsidy to be able to get to that outcome. So you would need to be subsidising maybe 50% or more of all of the process of getting to this, of being able to pay for workers, worker protections, etc., which means there is a constant and extremely high amount of subsidies that would have to be paid. That is expensive, but also obviously would trade off against other things. I think there's a pushback from Affirmative that is like, Australia is very rich, so they can still afford this, and that's fine. What Negative pushes back with is, well, yes, but Australia is in a constant deficit, so the fact they might be rich does not mean that they have like infinite money that they can throw at problems freely. That means that it is unlikely they can just totally throw money at the problem and it fixes things entirely. There will still be trade-offs, and those trade-offs will still be unpopular because this is not going to be something which is universally accepted. A lot of money will be spent on it, which is unpopular. Thirdly, there's lots of skepticism over manufacturing, given the fact that Australia has had a shift to being a service economy, has had to focus on the university sector far more, and has had to move away from manufacturing in the past. People aren't as keen to return to it. And fourthly, that the pushback from China that's likely to happen, for example, the fact that, as I extrapolated on further down the bench, China is a very important trade partner for Australia. It is one where they have quite a strong relationship in terms of the imports and exports they give to one another. And currently China does refine Australia's minerals. If it is the case that Australia explicitly enters the market as a competitor to China, that probably is going to be quite unpopular and damage that relationship. And that is something that will be lead to impacts which would also lead to this policy being unpopular for Australian citizens. All of that suggests that this is a policy that will not be popular, but therefore the fact that it is not popular means that there is not a guarantee that the policy will last into the future. It could be repealed by future governments, it could be outvoted, or simply you could pressure the current government to stop investing into it. That therefore means that it's not necessarily clear this policy necessarily even reaches the point of the infrastructure existing and you entering the market in this way, if the policy ends up being cut off before that infrastructure is finished. So I think there is a quite smart push that is weaponized further down the bench of it's not clear that this policy will last long enough that you would even get to the impacts that Affirmative is talking about. And that, I think, is also not quite responded to adequately by Affirmative, who are relying on, I think, good arguments as to why this would be a very good thing if Australia could enter the market, and Australia could be better at extracting these things than China is in the status quo, but I think aren't able to fully prove that without fiat in a supports motion, that this will happen well, and will happen in a way that is sustainable and lasts, in that the Australian government's incentives will always stay tied to this. So I think Negative is sufficiently able to cast doubt on those two questions that I am not convinced that Affirmative does get their policy to the impacts that they want. If they don't get to those impacts, the Negative just gets, you spend a lot of money on this, it trades off against other things, such as, for example, renewables and anything else that people might care about. It's very unpopular, and it's not really going to make a positive impact into the market, other than maybe making life a bit worse for Australian people for a while as you get pushback from China. So I think then the practical impact of that point ends up falling to side Negative. Secondly, on environmental effects, the push from side Affirmative here is that Australia, due to the fact that they have very high environmental regulations, is the kind of country that we would want to be doing this policy, because they're likely to do it quite well. They're likely to do it in a way that is environmentally conscious. They're likely to extract minerals and refine minerals in a way that is more environmentally aware than other countries otherwise would do. I think the pushback that you get from Negative is, firstly, that even if it is the case that Australia, in a vacuum, Australia extracting like 1 ton of rare earth minerals does so in a better way than China extracting 1 ton of rare earth minerals, it is not clear that this means that the proportion of the extraction of minerals, or like the, raw amount of extraction of rare earth minerals that happens in the world is static on both sides, in the sense that there are other countries that will have incentives to extract the minerals that they have now in order to get profits and still give them to China. Additionally, the refineries that China has will still have a certain amount that they are capable of refining, that they will want to refine to continue to meet their profit margins, which means that in many cases, perhaps Australia shifts their 8% and they start refining at home, and they start removing their minerals themselves. But that does not mean that they are taking a certain amount of taking minerals out of the ground out of the global economy and putting in Australia. It means they're taking a certain amount, but there are incentives of other actors to try and fill that gap with the removal and extraction of other minerals from other places, which means that the net amount or the total amount of minerals being extracted probably goes up rather than remaining static. And if it goes up, it is accepted that even if Australia is environmentally better than other countries, it is still doing a policy that is in some level environmentally harmful, and other countries that sort of, start extracting a little bit more. If it's China starts extracting substantially more than they were previously, or they get their West African counterparts and Latin American counterparts to extract more than they currently are, they will be, for the bit that they are adding now to the extraction on the global market, doing it in a way that is worse than what Australia was previously doing, which suggests that the environmental impact of extraction probably does fall to neg, given that the amount of extraction overall increases rather than staying static. So I think that there is a smart point from Affirmative that Australia is pretty good at the way they will do this environmentally. But I think if the overall amount of extraction doesn't stay static, then Negative is able to claim that there is more of an environmental harm than there would otherwise be on the counterfactual. That's how that gets resolved. Secondly, on the renewable stuff, there is a quibble about whether or not renewables are the alternative, and I agree that Negative does not have fiat to say that renewables are the way that this would otherwise be spent. But what I do think is done fairly well by the end of the Negative bench's speeches is that if it is the case that subsidies required for the Affirmative policy are so high, they will inevitably trade off against other things, and the fact that it will sort of feed the mining lobby, who will have different incentives to the kind of people who would want renewable energy to be prioritised more, does suggest that there will be at least some difference in lobbying as to how much renewables be given attention. There's, I think, a very smart response from Affirmative, which is, if renewables is something that is a bipartisan issue that people do care about, you will have more of these minerals at home, and therefore you will be able to kind of avoid some of the costs of sending them off to be refined in China and then shipping them back and then adding them into your renewables that you're making at home. I think this is clever, but I think they are probably correct that the amount of money the state gives into renewables, both in terms of trade-off in terms of subsidy, but also the money they might have generally to do these things and the amount of time and attention it gets due to lobbying on different issues is decreased, suggests that you probably overall focus less of your time and effort onto renewables on the AF world than you do on the neg. So I think, given that I don't think Affirmative has actually ended up solving the sub-issue of the impact of the extraction is better environmentally than it otherwise would be, the additional point that there is now a trade-off also as to how much you put into renewables, even if just until the period that this policy stops being taken care of and stops being prioritised, means that there is less of money going into renewables within Australia than there otherwise would be. And that means then that I think on quite a small and technical margin. There's a lot of things going on in this debate, but I think due to the overall way this ends up getting resolved, negative's able to show that the overall impact on the environment is probably worse than it is, it does more harm than it does good. Even though I think, given how the first clash has been resolved, this probably actually is only for the period of time until this policy stops really being prioritised, at which point things likely shift back to the median. But that means during that time, there are more environmental harms than there are environmental benefits to doing this. Therefore, this is also a clash that I think is narrowly won by the negative team. That is broadly how we saw the debate wrapping up. I do think this was a good debate. I think you should be quite happy with how you've done in this debate. It might have been helpful if teams could have weighed and prioritised specific issues a little bit more, and perhaps accepted that the other side might win on certain issues or allowed them to win on certain issues, because I think there ended up being a lot of sub-issues, some of which were very relevant and some of which may be a bit less relevant. But overall, I think the quality of analysis here was very good, and the speeches were also very good. So my broad takeaway would be, I think you should be quite happy and going into round 5 feeling pretty good.